Good afternoon, and welcome to our conversation, The Lamentations of Jeremiah, an intergenerational conversation on the crisis of our time. I'm Charles Powell, faculty affiliate at the Ansari Institute and moderator for this live event. One of my favorite quotes by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is, "Men often hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they cannot communicate, and they cannot communicate because they are separated." With the help of two esteemed leaders within the Black community and the United States, I hope that through narrative empathy, we can better understand and appreciate the rich history of Black America, the struggles endured, the accomplishments achieved, and the ongoing challenges that many within the Black community still face. Moreover, I hope that together we can build bridges of understanding, trust, and collaboration between Americans to end systemic racism. In the context of this conversation, I think it has been truthfully said, when Black lives matter, then and only then will all lives matter. In 2019, Norman Coombs wrote and published his book titled The Black Experience in America. In it, he traces Black heritage from slavery to emancipation, to Renaissance, to racism, to rebirth. The book eliminates the struggle. It illuminates the struggle of Black people in America. It has been said that for more than 400 years, countless people have endeavored to express just what it means to be Black in the United States. The effort has produced some of this nation's most profound literature, pivotal moments in history, and influential leaders. To be sure, the African American experience in the United States is vast and it is intense. Racial segregation in the United States is the segregation of facilities, services, and opportunities such as housing, medical care, education, employment, and transportation along racial lines. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, establishing a federal policy that prohibits racially segregated public accommodations and imposes penalties for racial discrimination in the workplace. 4 years later, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which included the Fair Housing Act, prohibiting racially motivated housing segregation. I think we can agree that laws help, but laws rarely change the hearts of people. Martin Luther King once said, "Morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. Judicial decrees may not change the heart, but they can restrain the heartless." Racial injustice is an ever-present disorder in the United States. In recent years, it has seen a resurgence. As Americans, let us continue to demand a moral response to racism, a response that leads to action and change for the better. Once again, Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. On behalf of the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion, situated in the Keough School of Global Affairs on the campus of the University of Notre Dame, it is my pleasure to welcome Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright. Renowned for his exuberant oratory, Reverend Wright is a master of the Jeremiad, a type of sermon that speaks truth to power by invoking biblical prophecy, offering a diagnosis of our fallen condition and issuing a call to repentance. In 2008, his sermons were caricatured by media outlets thanks to soundbite journalism, but Jeremiads resonate with many as prophetic. Dr. Wright, welcome to the conversation. Next, I am pleased to introduce former Wright scholar, Minister Tiauna Boyd Webb. Tiana is a young leader in the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, a recognized NGO of the United Nations that seeks to strengthen the individual and collective capacity of thought leaders and activists in the church, the academy, and the community through education, advocacy, and activism for human rights and social justice. Tiana, welcome to the conversation. This event today is presented by the Ansari Institute and co-sponsored by the University of Notre Dame's African Student Association, Black Student Association, Department of American Studies, the Initiative on Race and Resilience, and the Clow Center for Civil and Human Rights, as well as Indiana University South Bend's Civil Rights Heritage Center and the United Religious Community of St. Joseph County. Thank you all for your sponsorship. This event is live and heard all over the world. Audience, please note that the views and opinions of our guests do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion. Via the personal narrative, we give voice to the religious leaders of our time and hope that through narrative empathy, we can build bridges of understanding, trust, and collaboration on all matters relating to the essential human development of all people. Reverend Wright, you are pastor emeritus of Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, a congregation that you led for 36 years, during which its membership grew to over 8,000 parishioners. You are now retired, but you are still actively involved in the community. Would you please take a few minutes and share with us what it is that you are doing now?
First of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm writing my memoirs, and my two academic editors at Howard University are telling me I have two books instead of one. But I'm trying to write the story of my life, especially those years beyond the 36 years I was at Trinity, what I was doing before then. And since then, 18 years ago, I was one of the founders of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. So time-wise, I'm divided between memoirs, work with the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, and making good on all the promises I made before my stroke and before my retirement. While I was a pastor, I could not be away from our church for so many Sundays a year. I have friends, I have colleagues, I have academic types who get their churches to invite me. And while I was pastoring, I had to say no. I would take vacation, for instance, from Sunday night to skip one Sunday, come back the next Saturday, so I get 2 weeks vacation. But I kept saying no. When I retired, I was reminded by all my friends, remember you said once you no longer had a Sunday obligation, you come to be with us. We had 3 services on Sunday. So I was immediately after retirement, I was saying yes to all those people I had said no to across the years. The stroke, however, has cut that down, and then COVID cut it all down, except as we became more savvy with technology, they're now saying to me, well, you can preach virtual. We have virtual worship. I said, Romans 10 says, how shall they hear without a preacher? And I added that text to say, how can they preach? Not unless they be sent, but without a voice. So I'm trying to hide behind the physical incapability to get out of some of these invitations, doing a lot of teaching. I did lead one doctoral program since retirement at McCormick Theological Seminary on African-centered thought, African-centered preaching, and pastoring. That's it in a nutshell. Say I'm busier now that I'm retired than I was before retirement.
Reverend Wright, thank you. I think we can understand and appreciate the saying, I don't need your rocking chair. You're not ready to be in a rocking chair just yet. And we thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing with us your wisdom and insight. Reverend Webb, I want to say to the audience that Reverend Webb has given me permission to call her Tiana. And so from here forth, I will just say Tawana instead of Reverend Webb, and I mean absolutely no disrespect. when saying this. So Tiana, as one of the leaders of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, can you tell us a bit about your role there and what are some of your interests, as well as how are you connected with Dr. Wright?
Sure. I came to, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here. Reverend Wright, thank you for the invitation. Mama Ivor Carruthers, Dr. Ivor Carruthers, thank you. I came to Proctor about 10 years ago as a seminarian, and I stayed connected as I served in the Peace Corps in Ghana, and now I'm returning to Proctor as the Director of Missions and Programs. With Reverend Wright, I joined Trinity right after Reverend Wright retired, but he has supported my interest in Africa. So becoming the Reverend Wright Legacy Scholar at the Chicago Theological Seminary, he was really integral to me digging into missiology and studying a new paradigm for mission for African Americans, specifically serving in Africa, because I was concerned about neo-colonialism. And so now at the Proctor Conference as the Director of Programs and Missions, I am honored to work with the Proctor team as we pray, and as Senator Warnock told us yesterday, a Ghanaian proverb, when you pray, you move your feet. And that's what we do at Proctor. That's what I do as the Director of Missions and Programs. I pray and move my feet in step with the African American faith community to address critical needs of human and social justice within local, national, and global communities. Specifically in this past year, we've worked with programs ranging from environmental justice, truth-telling and sacred memory, Black Palestine transnational solidarity, ending criminalization. We've worked with census, education, and certainly get out the vote initiatives. My personal interest finds itself in the heart of in Africa, working specifically to address gender-based violence among women and girls in Africa and in Haiti.
Thank you. Some of the concerns and questions that are raised today, you have experience in these areas, and we really look forward to hearing your wisdom and insight and some problem solving that can go into many of the crises of our time. Dr. Wright, Minister Webb, audience, we have some real concerns, as you've already heard, to talk about. We have some very thought-provoking solutions to consider. So let's dive into this conversation on the Lamentations of Jeremiah, an intergenerational conversation on the crises of our time. First, I am going to ask Dr. Wright to help us understand the Jeremiah approach to preaching and social action. Then we will have 4 segments of this conversation: the lightning round, the intergenerational conversation round between Dr. Wright and Tiana, and the one-on-one conversation round. And finally, I will ask them to leave us with some inspirational words of hope. At the end, we will take some questions from the audience related to the conversation on the crises of our time. Reverend Wright, in the biblical books of Jeremiah and Lamentations, we find the prophet Jeremiah speaking out against idol worship and other sins committed by the people of Judah. God is the plaintiff, judge, and executioner. Jeremiah is the prosecutor. He holds nothing back. He speaks boldly to kings, officials, priests, prophets, and the common people. Unlike other prophets, Jeremiah revealed his personal feelings in the matters he addressed. He has been called the reluctant prophet. He did not ask to be the messenger, but once chosen, he gave his heart and his soul to it. You have used the books of Jeremiah and Lamentations as starting points for many of your sermons. Reflecting upon the Lamentations of the prophet Jeremiah, please share with our audience what a Jeremiad is and why you have found it useful in your preaching. Moreover, what have been some of your most influential Jeremiads? Reverend Wright?
I don't know about the last part of that question in terms of most influential. The tradition I was raised in, my full name, I don't think you know Charles, is Samuel Wright Jr. My father was a pastor in Philadelphia for 42 years. He was a graduate of Virginia Union university, and seminary. Growing up in that home, Dr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor is a member born and raised in Bank Street Baptist Church of Norfolk, also a graduate of Virginia Union University. Growing up in that home, my mother, also a graduate of Virginia Union University, my parents met there. Growing up in that milieu, I was saturated in that type of preaching from the time I was in my mother's arms. Some would say my mother's womb. I heard my dad do it. I heard her father do it, who was also a pastor. I heard her brother do it, who was Sam DeWitt Proctor, pastor. I heard Sam do it. And I understood God's call, primarily through Micah, what does the Lord require of thee? But to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God as prerequisites for preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. Prerequisite, and what, as you mentioned, Jeremiah was preaching not to the Amalekites. He wasn't preaching to the Jebusites. He was preaching to his people. We have messed up. And growing up in the Black community, I was painfully aware of racism, systemic racism, with white supremacy, but I was also painfully aware of how we bought into the narrative that was keeping feet on our necks, as Jeremiah did. So that became my paradigm, not just preach about what white folks are doing wrong. How are we buying into what do we need to repent from? What onus is upon us? So that genre of preaching became something that was automatic. I had, classic example, I'll tell you, my grandson, my oldest grandson, they correct me all the time. He is now a graduate of Howard University. He held Divinity School and he held it to the sacred music. When he was a senior in high school, I was taking him to church one night, the last night of the youth revival. For the youth revivals, I would bring in young preachers who spoke the hip hop language of teenagers that old folks like me did not know. And he asked me on the way to church, is this young man whom we had, how come he never touches on social justice issues in his preaching? I said, I don't know. He said, you never asked him? I said, no. He's 17. I'm going to ask him. I said, well, you go right ahead. After church, I said, did you ask Reverend? He said, yep. I said, what did he say? He said, he told me that's not his gift. I said, and how do you respond to that, Jay? He said, to me, Granddaddy, social justice is not a gift for preachers. It is a given. 17-year-old. Well, he's raised in our church. And it was the same way with me. It's a given. How can you preach the gospel of Jesus Christ without addressing justice issues? In his inaugural sermon, Jesus quoted Isaiah 61, justice, to preach the good news to the poor, not to the middle class, not to the condo owners, not to the upper middle class, not to the wannabe millionaires, to the poor, to set at liberty those who are held captive, to bind up the brokenhearted. That's a given. Now, if it was given for Jesus, and you're preaching the gospel, a lot of people say, well, we just preach Jesus. I think in the Southern Baptist Church, you've heard that before. We just preach Jesus. Dr. John Kennedy says, yes, but are you preaching what Jesus preached? And that is why Jeremiah became one of the genres that became one of my main stock in terms of the way I preach. and how I preach.
Thank you. And so we want to get right into the lightning round now. And in the lightning round and then the conversation series that we have, we'll have the opportunity to hear you speak to social justice concerns in our time. Thank you, Reverend Wright. Tiana, based on, let's move into this lightning round. And basically what I'll do, I'll ask you some questions. And then if you'll keep the response to about 3 minutes, and then we'll spend more time on some of the conversational topics. But Tiana, based on your, I see your hand. Yes, sir.
Tiana.
Tiana. Thank you.
Tiana, thank you.
See, it's easier for me to probably just say Minister Webb. It's probably the Southern accent causing me some trouble here. Tiana, thank you.
Thank you.
Based on your personal experiences, your research, and your collaborative work through the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, and of course your academic teaching, what do you think is or should be one of the top messages of influential Black leaders today, and why?
Sure. I think one of the top messages should focus on this notion of not going back to normal. I think a lot of the conversation that we hear about, after COVID, going back to normal, things going back to the way that they used to be. And I've heard some preachers say it, and I think that it should be shared more, is that this disruption that we are facing now could be seen as an inbreaking, a space to envision and create something more humane, because what we have in this country isn't working. The social order in this country has never worked for Black people. So I think that just an acknowledgement that we are living in an unprecedented time in the aftermath of the Trump presidency, in the shadow of the white nationalist insurrection during a pandemic where many are economically and socially and mentally challenged more than ever. I mean, police brutality has claimed the lives of so many more over this past year. We are watching the reality of the United States emergency management systems collapse before our very eyes. I mean, the death toll now is 500,000 and 4.3 million people in Texas without power, without heat. 58 lost their lives just trying to stay warm. So I think as this grief is washing over us, as we are seeing family members die, and as we are attending funerals on Zoom in the middle of work meetings, one of the top messages for influential Black leaders, and as I've heard, and it should continue to be, that our social order isn't working and something more humane must be possible. And we can see these challenges as possibly an inbreaking, that creative space to help us vision and bring to fruition something different.
Thank you. Reverend Wright, Ben Crump, who is a public speaker, author, and attorney for civil rights, says, systemic injustices and racism have deep historical roots in this country. Broadly speaking, these terms are defined as deeply ingrained racist thinking, practices, and actions embedded in the core foundations of American society that have persisted over centuries and continue today. What do you think is the most problematic ingrained racist thinking that needs to be exposed, and why?
I think it is the thinking of Christians, those who call themselves Christians, and who cannot see any contradiction between January 6th, Confederate flag in the Capitol, smearing feces on John Lewis's picture, urinating in the hall, thinking they're Christian. And to tell them otherwise, I mean, that's deeply ingrained. The history of lynching involved preachers who would wear black robes in the morning, take them off and put on white robes for the Klan in the afternoon, and lynch Black people, and see nothing wrong with that, no contradiction whatsoever. Two famous evangelical white Christians recently called Kamala Harris a Jezebel. They see nothing wrong with that. just the name is an automatic catchword for folks who are Christian who know the Bible. Well, that kind of thinking, in my history of religions background, trace it back past the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers saw nothing wrong with holding slaves while declaring these truths to be self-evident. The Founding Fathers, however, are preceded by something I believe you studied, I hope you studied at Catholic Theological Union, the Doctrine of Discovery, where in the 15th century, the Pope sent out a papal bull saying, it's all right to take the land wherever your feet are placed and convert the indigenous people, and if they do not convert, kill them. To see people as less than human, to define Africans in our founding documents as non-person, non-humans, 3/5 of a man, gets embedded in the Christian message that people hear on Sunday, that the folks who were in the Capitol January 6th heard all their lives, that they believe, I'm sure you did, Paula White preaching, calling on God to use Trump as his Messiah, speaking in tongues and calling on gods from Jamaica, the Caribbean, and Africa. That kind of deeply seated religion, that's the most important center, epicenter for me of religious thought. Southern Baptist Church just apologized for slavery in the last century and still think women are inferior and that God cannot call women into ministry. That kind of deep-seated religious stuck on stupid for me, excuse me, he already did a disclaimer and said, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways. But that kind of thinking, I think, is the worst and most deeply rooted, toxic kind of thinking that has to be torn out, uprooted, and replaced.
So there's this idea that Christians need to clean up their own backyards,
Yeah, yes.
from what I'm hearing you say. And how, in your mind, in just a few words, what do you think are some of the most important actions that Christians can take today to ward off racism?
Using your words, starting in their own backyards, starting with self-examinations, starting with congregational deep studies, where persons like you, persons like John Meacham, persons who are white, that they trusted. There's not the automatic distrust because somebody of color is coming into the congregation. To have Alan Buzak, to have John Meacham talk and lead studies, not one sermon, not one coffee clutch, but a series of studies on what is it we believe? Why do we believe that? How do we get this way? Where do we go? Where do we go from here? Not asking Blacks or Hispanics or Asians, but self-examination is where I think.
Thank you, Reverend Wright. We'll move to the next question in the lightning round. Minister Webb, according to the Vera Institute, 61% of Black voters indicated that they are someone they know has been unfairly stopped or harassed by the police. Many Black voters support shifting funds from policing to community and family support. Do you agree or disagree, and why?
I agree. I agree. I think we know from our lived reality as Black people in this country what's going on with the police. The Sentencing Project reminds us that African Americans are incarcerated at a rate more than 5 times as white people. So I agree, and I believe in defunding, in shifting funds from policing to the community. I support the Breathe Act, which was developed by the Movement for Black Lives. And I support the demand that Black Lives Matter has in divesting federal resources from incarceration and policing, investing in new non-carceral approaches to community safety that leads to states shrinking their criminal legal systems and centering the protection of Black lives. So that includes Black mothers and Black trans people and Black women. I believe in allocating new money to build healthy and sustainable and equitable communities. And I believe in holding our political leaders to their promises and enhancing the self-determination of all Black communities. And these are points that are supported by the Black Lives Matter movement for defunding the police.
Thank you. And that takes us into the next question. Reverend Wright, as you know, the Black Lives Matter organization was founded in 2013 and seeks to organize people to fight for Black equality, something you have been an advocate of most of your life. You have seen and participated in sit-ins, boycotts, marches, demonstrations, and other types of activities that fight for equality. Do you see the leading voices and messages of Black Lives Matter as a Jeremiah? Why or why not?
Yes, I do see it as a Jeremiah because it follows in the pattern of critiquing a system that does not take all of its citizens as equal. We are all created in the image of God. Yet, as Minister Webb says, the social structure in this country has never treated African Americans as equal. And Jeremiah will be preaching against that today. Black Lives Matter has given up on the church by and large because the church is playing a game of going on to get along, don't make waves. And they're saying, no, the system, you cannot reform cancer. You have to root cancer out and then begin treatment. So I see it as a Jeremiah. That's why their strong stance of equity and equality.
Minister Webb, according to the New York Times, Black Lives Matter may be the largest movement in US history. The movement has gone global. Why do you think this has caught the world's attention? And do you think that by it catching the world's attention, it will have more of an influence on US policymakers and the American public to bring about lasting systemic change, change that fosters racial equality?
I would certainly hope so. I give honor to Sisters Patrice Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi for developing the Black Lives Matter movement. But when I think about your question, I think that for me the challenge is paying attention to the movement, because the world is now paying attention. Doesn't guarantee any type of allegiance to a shared commitment on the set values or the end goals of Black Lives Matter. So we know that international headlines has been on Black Lives Matter. The first international headline was in 2015 in the aftermath of Sandra Bland. So we know that the gaze of the world has been on this organization for 6 years. And I have a healthy level of suspicion that equating protest, while they're great, I don't know how much sustainable systemic change that will lead to, because we know that Afrophobia around the globe is on the rise. I don't know if white folks on TV who are marching in other countries with Black Lives Matter signs are really committed to the movement. I think they're having a reaction to the most recent traumatic event, which is George Floyd. Which is warranted, but I think I'm just cautious and being over hopeful about what's possible, because you know, the globe is now paying attention to the organization. But I'm certainly hopeful that eventually, through the presence of these protests, that a shift in public opinion will come and lead to some sustainable systemic changes.
Yes, thank you. Reverend Wright, staying along these same lines here, hashtag Living While Black is used to shed light on all the ways that Black people are racialized, stereotyped, and victimized in public and sometimes private spaces. As a pastor, it must cut to your heart to know and to see the people you love being victims of such hate. How do you address this in a constructive way without furthering the racial divide between many Blacks and non-Blacks, specifically white Americans?
When I was a pastor, Charles, I addressed it both in the pulpit and in the classroom, teaching almost where you hate the sin but not the sinner, and helping our members to see that this is what I said earlier. This is how certain people are raised. And what we got getting mad at them is not going to change anything. You got to change the system that bumped them up into thinking and believing these things that cause these laws. I did it not to preempt your closing, where you asked us to think of some words of hope, but I did it constantly trying to use a mantra that Janice Hale gave me in 1972 in her book, Black Children, Their Cognitive, Culture, and Learning Styles. Different does not mean deficiency. They're different. And if how we use humor many times to show Black congregants and white congregants in white congregations how we do things differently, it does not mean one is superior to the other, ergo white supremacy. It means one is different from the other. And because it's different does not mean it's deficient, it's just different. Can you, where you're sitting, clap to the song, clap your own hands? What a fellowship, what a joy divine. You're clapping on the European beat.
Yes, I have no rhythm whatsoever, but
Africans,
I can play the radio beautifully.
Africans clap on 2 and 4. Europeans clap on 1 and 3. Same thing with 3, 4 times, 6, 8 times. Europeans clap on 1, 4, 1, 4. Africans clap on 2, 3, 5, 6, 2, 3, 5, 6. Doesn't mean one is superior and one is inferior, it means they're different. And I show them the same thing in terms of speech, in terms of learning habits, cognitive, left brain, right brain. Difference does not mean deficiency. That cuts down on the hate level. And I never thought of that. Yeah, it's just different.
We should be able to complement each other.
Yes. And God specializes in difference. He loves diversity. No two snowflakes are the same. No two cultures are the same. No two people are the same. Showing me that lesson home in many different ways as I could is how I addressed it when I was a pastor.
Thank you. Minister Webb, society has tried to define Black America for centuries. Some of what you hear and see must truly appall you. What do you say to those who try to define you? And what words of encouragement can you offer to young Black Americans who dare to dream?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I would have much to say to those who try to define me, because I've learned not to try to reason with evil. It's exhausting and it's not healthy. It's not healthy for me. I've learned in my experience as a Black woman in this country, on November 4th, when 75 million people voted for Trump, and on January 6th with the insurrection, and on February 13th, when white Republicans voted for his acquittal. Some things that people do more than appall me, it's an evil. Just how committed they are to the subjugation of others. And this morning at the Proctor Conference, during the seminarian session, Reverend Dr. Ebony Marshall Terman reminded us that Black Christian theological imagination transforms the Black communities. It is made up of freedom dreams. So something that I can say to encourage dreamers is that we have a long tradition of dreamers to thank. And hope, and to my elders who have made a way, to Reverend Wright, we thank you for your work, for dreaming and inspiring this generation to keep our hands to the plow. So I think that that's encouraging for those who are dreaming and those who will continue this work.
Thank you. Some of what both of you have said certainly makes some in the audience, no doubt, feel a bit uncomfortable. It stretches them, but that's exactly what we need in order to grow and to develop and to be better citizens and to truly come together and complement each other the way many of us believe God has intended. The next round, the next segment, I'm going to ask Reverend Wright, and notice I'm saying Minister Webb now, so I don't mess up on your name again. But I'll ask you to engage each other. I'll present a topic and ask a question to get the conversation initiated. And then if you will dialogue for about 5 to 7 minutes, think of it as a fireside chat in the living room, but via Zoom. And Reverend Wright, if you will be so kind as to speak to the concerns raised as an orator of God's word, a pastor and a Black liberation theologian, and Minister Webb, if you will speak to the concerns raised as director of missions and programs and an activist in the community, as well as a professor in the academy. The first topic concerns the criminal justice system, something that you've already touched base on briefly. But the civil rights lawyer turned legal scholar Michelle Alexander authored the book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. She calls mass incarceration a racial caste system to emphasize how Black people are stigmatized and oppressed by laws, customs, and practices that have been structured to work against them. Alexander points out in her book that though Jim Crow laws were wiped off the books decades ago, there is still an extraordinary percentage of the African American community, particularly that is warehoused in prisons, are trapped in a parallel social universe, denied basic civil rights and human rights, including the right to vote, the right to serve on juries, and the right to be free of legal discrimination in employment, housing, access to education, and public benefits. Today, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. However, Alexander writes, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against convicted criminals in nearly all the ways in which it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once labeled a felon, even for a minor drug crime, the old forms of discrimination are suddenly legal again. In her words, we have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it. Alexander shows that by targeting Black men through the war on drugs and decimating communities of color, the US criminal justice system functions as a contemporary system of racial control, even as it formally adheres to the principle of colorblindness. The new Jim Crow challenges the civil rights community and all of us to place mass incarceration at the forefront of a new movement for racial justice in America. So, Reverend Wright and Minister Webb, here are a few questions I would like for you to entertain and then shed some light upon. First of all, it has been argued that the criminal justice system in the United States generates, supports, and sustains racial inequalities. For those who would argue otherwise, what say you? Furthermore, what can be done in the church, the community, the academy, and government to foster a non-biased criminal justice system? Additionally, what are some of the long-term effects mass incarcerations are having on the Black community? So this is where I ask you to put some concrete strategies of action in place for us as you talk about this topic around the fireside, so to speak.
Well, Tiana, I'll dive in first as an old man.
Please do.
One of the things I found out in 36 years of pastoring is that unless congregations, and you really can't do this virtually, are made to feel aware, painfully, personally, publicly aware of how the criminal justice system has affected the people that are sitting in church beside, it remains something, a topic that's out there somewhere. Those people, those criminals, those inmates. One Sunday I asked members worshiping at all three services, how many of you have someone in prison in your family, or you have been in prison under supervision, ankle bracelet, house arrest, stand? And the majority of the congregation stood. It's only with that visual kind of thing I found out that, oh, when you talk about criminal justice, you're talking about my family. You're talking about my dad. Now, what do we do about that? Well, the prison ministry we started came up with some fascinating ideas, not the end all be all, but ways in which congregations can address those issues piece by piece. One is a program called Moms and Me, where members of the prison ministry would take children of incarcerated women, because we always forget about women. Not always, but we tend to think of Law and Order SVU, Law and Order Criminal Intent. There are mothers who are incarcerated for having 2 joints in their pocketbook. Who takes their kids to see them on visiting days? We're in Chicago. Where's the closest women's prison? Joliet, there's the difference between jail and prison. Some moms and mothers take the children to Joliet, which is only about 30 miles. But Dwight's about 50, 100 miles downstate Illinois. Who cares about who is caring for? Who makes Christmas for those kids? Those kind of personal touches which make the criminal justice system come alive in the minds of members of a congregation. Now, that's the old school approach in terms of it doesn't solve it. The lawyers of our church are working together on juvenile justice and restorative justice. So it's divided into segments. Everybody can't do the same thing. Lawyers can attack the legal issues. Moms and dads, or just guys who volunteer to drive the kids to prison, can do something else. Christmas time, everybody can. How many kids? You got 2 children. You got Anaya, and 2
Two
sons.
sons.
So this Christmas coming up, instead of buying 2 presents, you buy 3. One is for the child of an incarcerated mother who can't make Christmas for her kid. Those kind of practical things that keeps on your mind year round. Every time you look at your kid, you think about that kid whose mother's in jail. Well, that's one practical hands-on thing in 3 different sections because the attorneys are busy. And the attorneys in Illinois, by the way, in restorative justice did get the ballot, did get the box removed from the application. There's a box many people aren't aware of. Have you ever been arrested? Have you ever been tried, convicted? Once you check that box, there are 52 jobs you are ineligible for in the state of Illinois, including becoming a barber. Well, our lawyers got that in concert with lawyers from other churches and the restorative justice movement of Community Renewal Society. They got that box taken off every application in the state of Illinois. To have it on an application puts you in violation of a state law. So you're doing a legal thing, you're doing a loving thing. Those are my input on this fireside chat.
So there's old school. Now, how about new school?
Yes.
That was phenomenal, very practical, very personal. I would say read. The first thing for people who say otherwise, read Michelle Alexander's text. I think Dr. Powell, you laid it out perfectly. Through her book, you can peel back the curtain on Nixon's 1971 tough on crime drug policies to see what happened to the prison industrial complex and how the criminal justice system generates, supports, and sustains racial inequalities. Number 2, follow the money. Study the Koch brothers. Take a look at private prisons and for-profit prisons and how they flourished under the Trump administration. The numbers don't lie. And if people still aren't convinced, I would say study what impact prisons really have on drug users. And if you do, you'll find that incarceration has no impact on stopping people from using drugs. Even the opposite, incarceration is linked to an increase in the chances that a drug user will die from overdose. So the system was never designed to rehabilitate. It was never designed to stop the use of drugs. It was designed as an inhumane tool of social control over poor Black and brown people in this country. So people who don't see it that way, I think that those are 3 things that they can do is just to study, learn, and look at the numbers. And what can be done, I think Reverend Wright has offered some really great practical things that people can do. I think that we all can, in the church and community and the academy, advocate for ending the drug war. We can advocate for legalizing marijuana in places where it is not. Decriminalizing the use of cannabis. We can look to Oregon and learn from it, as it is the only state in the nation that has decriminalized drugs more broadly. And I think we can stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. We can learn about spread awareness about the demand to defund the police. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding on the narrative of what that really means. And we can sign up to be a co-sponsor, community co-sponsor to the Breathe Act.
Dr. Wright, anything else you'd like to say?
I'm going to ask Tiana, what does the 13th Amendment do?
It gives people the right to vote, right?
No. That's 14th. 15th. 14th is citizens, 15th is right to vote. 13th, what does what? Abolishes
Slavery.
for everybody in this country except prisoners.
Okay.
And most people don't know that. Prisoners are still slaves according to the Constitution. They have no rights in an age of colorblindness. No rights whatsoever. Working with Brian Alexander, Innocence Project, lawyer, legal Benjamin Crump, to get that changed is yet another step. And when you talk about In addition to Michelle Alexander's book, there are two other books I would recommend that people who disagree read. One is Slavery by Another Name, which talks about the convict lynch system, which most Americans are not aware of. And the other is by Khalil Gibran Muhammad. You got your Google in front of you? Google is your friend. Google the title of his book, Khalil Gibran Muhammad. He shows in his book how the field of sociology, the discipline of sociology, shows sociologists and ancillary field psychologists, white, therapists, white, that the darker you are, the more likely you are to commit a crime. With that kind of mentality, getting pulled over by police, they let me go before they let Earl Mason go.
Thank you both. You both certainly have your finger on the pulse with what's going on, and certainly some concrete strategies of action that need to take place moving forward. Some steps are already being taken in the right direction, but obviously you advocate for many more of those to take place. I'd like for us to move into the next topic. It has to do with racial disparities in healthcare, specifically the global pandemic. Research shows that racial disparities in the healthcare system have harmful effects on Black communities, specifically Black and Brown communities, but for the sake of this conversation, Black communities. Senator Patty Murray, Democrat of Washington, who is a ranking member of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, issued a report on racial disparities in COVID-19 calling for congressional action. She said, the pandemic has just opened up a glaring wound in the healthcare system of our country. People of color are hit harder, mortality rates are higher, and they do not have access to healthcare, so they can't get the medical support they need. There are also pre-pandemic issues that contribute to this, such as income, geography, and occupation. A recent article in the New England Journal of Medicine reads, COVID-19 disparities should be situated in the context of material resources deprivation caused by low socioeconomic status, chronic stress brought on by racial discrimination, or place-based risk. Recent data from the CDC suggests that Black and Latino children are more likely to be infected with COVID-19. Now, based on these findings, we know that COVID-19 is not an equal opportunity killer, as some have suggested. A few questions to guide the conversation. First of all, what can be done to help ensure that the Black community trust the healthcare system enough to get the vaccine? And secondly, what can be done to make the vaccine more available to Black communities? And finally, what are the barriers hindering healthcare services being more available to Black communities? So if you could flesh these questions out and this topic out a bit more between the two of you, I would appreciate it.
You have any ideas, Tiana?
You know,
Go ahead.
Okay. When I hear this question, I think that distrust is warranted. I mean, I think that it's wonderful that we have a vaccine and it's available. But I think that, if the Tuskegee experiments taught us any important lessons, if we know from, our Black bodies being in this healthcare system, and, I have 2 young children, and me and my spouse knew the risk of me dying was exponentially higher, just because I was a Black woman dealing with our healthcare system. So I understand the distrust, and I don't think confronting this issue, I don't think we should problematize the distrust. I think the problem is the healthcare system, and I think once we get that right, trust will follow. Right. So I think that once we address the institutional racism within our healthcare, once we address the bias against Black people, once we have systems that are truly equitable, I think that distrust will lessen. But until then, I think that we're asking folks to trust a system that's harmed them and continues to harm them, which is a problem.
I was laughing because Charles questioned his home, not metaphorically, but realistically. I've got family members who refuse to get the vaccine because they think it's all part of a system designed to kill Black people, like the Tuskegee Institute. Family members. So when he says, "Well, can we do to build trust?" Help me, Charles. I got family members.
Yeah, I tell you, I was speaking with someone in my family the other day, and this person was also very reluctant to get the vaccine for various reasons. She wound up moving forward and getting it, and I'm glad to tell you she's healthy and doing well. And this is now 3 days later. Hopefully, she'll continue in that good direction.
Well, my son, who is 40, I got the vaccine. He refuses. He said, "I'm gonna watch what happens to you." So I said, "If I don't die, that proves it's okay." What kind of scientific reasoning is that? But the question touches on one that you asked Minister Webb earlier in the lightning round, in terms of one of the most important issues the Black leaders, Black ministers ought to be addressing. Charles, the last 3 presidential debates, 2 with Obama, 1 with Trump, 2 with Trump, have not touched on the issue of poverty. We seem, Dr. King, you quoted him 3 times in your opening segment. Dr. King died, was murdered, was killed when he was starting a poor people's campaign. That's what William Barber has picked up. We don't talk about the poor. We don't care about the poor. Most of our churches don't want the poor in our church. We don't want the homeless smelling like urine, feces, menses, blood. It's like lepers. Keep them over there. They have no access. Of course, they have no access to health care. They can't get a job. And yet, the poor, we give the congresspersons hefty raises and won't give the poor never a living wage, fighting over a minimum wage of $15. McDonald's fighting for $15 an hour. That's part of that, to me, is part of the health disparities problem. Don't leave that poverty out of that equation. Because low income, how about no income? With COVID-19, who was the first laid off? Black folk will tell you who's the first laid off anyway, before COVID-19. Healthcare inequities, education inequities. Which school districts get the heftiest sums of money? The rich school districts. Poor school districts have teachers trying to train 40, 35 kids in one classroom. Tiana, who's in a different generation, that's why I can play with her. Tiana has 2 children. How old are Anaya?
2.
And 2 sons.
6 months.
Charles, do you know they take music lessons?
Fantastic.
Some poor kids will never see a piano, clarinet, trombone, trumpet. I think those are issues, along with Barber, picking up King's mantle, that the church, Black and white, needs to address. only white church. Now, Southern Baptists might have more poor churches than American Baptists, Catholic, Episcopal parish, Presbyterian parish. But unless you're talking about Appalachia, what poor white folk, except the hillbillies, are we talking about on a Sunday morning? We keep talking about Sunday morning is the most segregated hour. Yeah, but not just by race, by class.
Mm.
And there is another reason for Jeremiah is, if I was still a pastor, I'd be making my members mad talking about how we don't want the brothers who are bagging and sagging, who can't put one sentence together without splitting an infinitive, having a dangling participle or cuss word in it, because that's how they talk. We don't want them in our churches. Those are the very folks Jesus hung around. In fact, the Pharisees and Sadducees got upset with him because he's talking to publicans and sinners. Fortunately, he doesn't say what kind of sinners, because I'll probably be in that group. While you were talking about, was it Oregon you mentioned, Tiana, and drug laws? Which
Mhm.
state? Was it
Oregon?
Oregon?
Yeah, yes, sir.
You just gave me, remember, you just gave me the name of a new ministry when I go back to pastoring. Puff Pass Ministry.
Oh,
Charles didn't understand that.
Well, I tell you, everything that you're talking on is very important. And of course, I shared with you when we were corresponding via email prior to this event that I was a Southern Baptist minister for nearly 20 years. And I often shared with my congregation that we are a hotel for the saints, but we are a hospital for the hurting. And we need to have our doors open to people from all different walks of life, inviting them to come in and showing the love of God to them, the genuine, authentic love of God. And I know you can preach, and if I was turned loose, I could preach and we'd never get through this. So I think this is a good point for us to move forward with this next question that I have for both you and Tiana. And it has to do with inherited trauma. And I think you've already touched on a bit of this in what you just talked about. But can you both speak to inherited trauma in the Black community? What are some of the ways that it manifests itself, and what kind of resources are needed to address this trauma so that positive conflict resolution can truly take place? Reverend Wright, you already mentioned when you were talking about the Jeremiah that you were introduced to preaching and singing while you were even in your mother's womb, how your mother felt in some ways impacted you even when you were in her womb. So could you kick us off and talk for a moment about inherited trauma, what that is and what it means?
Joy Degree has done considerable work on post-traumatic slave syndrome, as have Dr. Naeem Akbar, Dr. Wade Nobles, and the Association of Black Psychologists, showing how generations of Blacks are carrying wounds that have not yet healed or even had any attempts at healing them because of the trauma of being Black in this country. I think you read one of the statistics, I think it was in this Zoom. I live in Zoom hell, talking about how Blacks are affected by and carry within them the hurts and pain of racism in this country, discrimination in this country, fear, walking while Black, living while Black, driving while Black, eating while Black. Tiana and Tareen have a little boy, Tucson. He's got a bullseye on his back. When he has to go to school, just the fear of letting him walk to school by himself, because a lot of the gang activity and gang behavior is a result of generations of trauma. the hatred turns in on yourself, and you know you can't shoot no white man, so you shoot a black brother to show you a man. That's the ways in which it manifests itself in the black community. A lot of the gun violence is a direct result of inherited trauma and self-hatred. How can that be worked on, addressed? In part of defunding the police, take away money from militarization of the police forces and put it in mental health. In mental health, in the state of Illinois, they have done away with mental health. They're turning mentally ill, mentally challenged, mentally disturbed people free to walk the streets, turning them out of prison, closing mental health facilities instead of providing money for more mental health and mental health care workers. They cut that funding. It's that kind of idiotic approach to social ills that I do not understand. But I suggest, I recommend, push for, advocate for more money for mental health workers, mental health training. Some of the deaths Tiana mentioned that causes fear of police is that some of the deaths of white police on black bodies is not the result of crime. It's a result of not knowing how to handle a mentally ill person that they encounter. So that mental health training is not just for mental health professionals, social workers, MSWs, but for police, to train police the difference between a hardened criminal and somebody who needs help mentally rather than pulling the trigger or stun gun. Youngster Tiana, your turn.
Thank you, Reverend Wright. I agree with everything that you said, and I also think that inherited trauma can manifest itself in the way our society is ordered. So it looks like the racial wealth divide, or it looks like Black people dying at greater risk for diseases that are avoidable, or it looks like children being funded from school to prison, or inherited trauma can look like the erasure of Black childhood. And I think that as Reverend Wright's ministry can attest to, the Black church historically has been the place that addresses these traumas because they stem from a lie. And I'm remembering Reverend Dr. Ebony Marshall Turman so much just leaving the Proctor Conference seminarian session, where she was reminding us that the Black church and Black theology continues to believe that God intends on every person to be free. So these traumas are addressed there. And for positive conflict resolution, I think for my generation, would look more like an action, like reparations would be a step towards positive conflict resolution to this trauma. Again, defunding the police would look like a positive step towards conflict resolution to some of the trauma that we're seeing. I think that the time for conversations about racial reconciliation and conflict mediation, absent of justice, absent of things like reparations, absent of things like truth telling. I don't think that my generation wants to entertain those options.
Thank you both for sharing your ideas back and forth. Time is of the essence, and I want to get to just a few more concerns and questions. And Minister Webb, I'll ask you this next question, and it has to do with the topic of climate justice. It has been argued that communities of color experience worse effects and receive fewer protections than white communities According to the NAACP's 2012 cold-blooded study, communities of color breathe in 40% more polluted air than white communities across the US. Additionally, those Black Americans make up 13% of the US population. A startling 68% live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant, compared to 56% of whites. This zone is where residents breathe the most resultant pollutants, which can cause a range of health problems from heart attacks to birth defects to asthma, states the NAACP. Moreover, Blacks are more likely to live near toxic sites, including those housing waste from fossil fuel infrastructure. Just by one example, Dr. Bullard, a professor of Texas Southern University, known as the father of environmental justice for his pioneering work in the field, points to the aftermath of the 2010 BP oil spill. When a BP underwater oil well burst in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010, it leaked a mind-boggling 94 to 184 million gallons of oil into the Gulf. BP hired private contractors to clean up the oil-coated sand and refuse from the 120 miles of Gulf coastline the well had polluted. While the spill and the environmental devastation wreaked are well known, what is less known is that the waste from the shoreline cleanup effort was trucked to landfills, mostly in Black communities in Louisiana and Alabama and Florida. So, Minister Webb, in your opinion, what is the climate justice effort, and how can we work to ensure that communities of color get equal protection from their government representatives?
Thank you for this question. I think it's so important. The climate justice effort is about states responding to the environmental degradation, climate change. So states are making a transition to a green economy and mainstreaming aspects of the clean energy movement to address some of these problems and try to slow the damage. So there's solar initiatives, there's carbon-free power initiatives, legislation that supports green jobs that are popping up all over the country. The problem is, and I think you addressed it, is that when these things happen, as you talked about through your stories, communities of color are hit not only first but worst. And there's so many things that we don't understand about environmental injustice that's literally killing off communities. So the problem, the gap in information, the gap in the linking Black communities to these initiatives when states transition to a green economy is some of the work that the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference has been doing over this past few years through the support of the Energy Foundation, just having conversations with African American church communities about different pieces of legislation, about energy audits. People don't know that you can have companies come into your church and figure out ways in which your church can be more environmental friendly, and then make those changes and paying for those changes, make those changes. There's rebates, there's things that are available to citizens, and too often Black communities, urban communities, poor communities are left out of the conversation. And it goes something that Reverend Wright was talking about earlier with criminalization. Once you make it personal, once you tell people what's happening in their communities, once you tell people what's happening to the earth, people are more apt to get on board with the climate justice movement. So it's not, I think the narrative is out there that African American communities don't care. It's not that we don't care, but sometimes we don't have the awareness, we don't have the information to make that connection.
Thank you. In just a few moments, we'll take just a few questions from the audience. And I also want to ask a question or two about some triumphs of Black America, so we can certainly leave on a positive note, one full of hope and action. Another question, Dr. Wright, You pastored one of the largest churches in America, a very influential church in Chicago. You have written and preached thousands of sermons. Your preaching has been heard all over the world. You have tried and indeed accomplished great results as you preached what you believe to be truth to power in Jeremiah fashion. You are loved by many. I told you earlier, I'm a pastor, and there were people who loved me, and there were people who didn't necessarily love me. They did not always like what I had to say. So there are some who misunderstand you and disapprove of some of your statements. But being a truth teller, a bridge builder, and peacemaker, when given the opportunity, you have tried to clarify and give perspective to your comments. When you have misspoken, as every human being does, you have not hesitated to apologize. Some within our audience are not aware of the efforts you have made towards reconciliation. And I wonder if you could take just a few moments to express to our audience, in your words and from your perspective, how they should understand the controversies of Jeremiah.
Thank you for your question. I'll start with the last part of your question to try to address it. My words, you said some in our audience today might not understand my words trying to seek reconciliation. And I would change one word. I wasn't trying to seek reconciliation. I was trying to seek clarification. There's a difference, for instance. The biggest controversy is not internal to Christianity. It is internal to our Jewish brothers and sisters. Many persons, Christian and non-Christian, do not understand the difference between Judaism and Zionism. And they are very different realities. And when talking about Zionists, I should have been clear and said Zionist and not Jew. Now, I know, being a graduate of Catholic Theological Union and a Southern Baptist pastor, you never watched programs like The View. But on The View, back during the biggest controversies of Jeremiah, which is when the media took sound bites of my sermons, old sermons, nothing current while Obama was running for president, one from 2005 before he was even a senator, and one from 2001, the Sunday after the 9/11/01 attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. The View was playing those clips run by Fox News, ABC, CBS, so forth. Footnote, you need to know, our listening audience, viewing audience needs to know, those networks came to our church and spent $2,000 each buying 20 years worth of sermons to comb through them to see what the Obamas had listened to for 20 years. And the two sound bites that they took were grossly taken out of context. Well, The View was playing one context, and the members of Trinity Church were up on their feet clapping and egging me on. And Hasselbeck, the wife of one of our NFL players, said, look at them, look at them, look at them. How can they do that? Whoopi Goldberg said, he's not talking to you. He's talking to his congregation, which is what I said earlier on a parallel track. When talking about Jeremiah was not preaching to the Babylonians. He was not preaching to the Amalekites. He was not preaching he was talking to his own people. And Black people understood every word I was saying every Sunday I preached. That's how the congregation grew from 87 to 8,000 active tithing members, because I was speaking not truth as I saw it, but the reality with which they lived daily. the reality we've been talking about all afternoon. Yeah, there were JDs, PhDs. We used to call ourselves the alphabet soup. We had all the alphabets: A, B, BS, MD, PhD, DDS, and ADC. You know what ADC is? That's welfare, members of our church. Because the letters behind our name, our philosophy was, or how you make a living. The church is about how you make a life. And our church understood that Black lives matter. To the dominant society, however, only Black bodies have mattered since the founding of this country. Bodies enslaved from 1619 to 1787, then defined in the Constitution in 1787 as property, not people. They live every Sunday. They come to church with that reality. So my sermons are resonating with them. They weren't controversial. There was no mass walkout. People leaving because I was speaking to a reality and what God intends in terms of what do we do with this reality. And as you said, when you listen to the whole sermon, one thing you did, I got so tickled and I told him to his face, in his famous Philadelphia speech, our former president said, my sermons offer no hope. I said, I would have thought that the first African-American editor of the Harvard Law Review would have at least listened to the sermon or read it before commenting on it, because that sermon, the day of Jerusalem's fall, offers nothing but hope for people who were confused and hurt and angry about 9/1101. But you hadn't heard the sermon, and you commented on it. He came to my living room, Controversies with Jeremiah Wright, and apologized. He said, Rev, you're right. I had not heard the sermon. I said, you're apologizing to me in my living room. You threw me under the bus on national and international TV. Go back and tell all those folks you did that to. Of course, he wouldn't do that because he needed to get elected. But the controversies were media generated. They were old sermons. I've been preaching. Let me tell you what my dad said now. Toss the ball to Tiana. We have been on the radio in Philadelphia, my hometown, for 20 years. When my dad was dying and in hospice care, I was with him every other month. The doctors gave him 4 months to live. I was with him 1 month. My sister was with him every day for 1 month. I was with him 1 month. The last month I was with him every day. The radio station we were on was a Black-owned radio station. It was purchased, Charles, by a white station. I will not call their name because they're racist. And we almost owned that station when we were on the radio because they told us they had to change our hours because we were on white time. Did you know there was white time for white radio on Sunday? My dad, they were purchased, the Black station was purchased by that station. My dad, while dying, said to me, boy, you know there's a new station, they're gonna let you stay on there. I said, yes, Dad, I know that. He said, them white folk don't wanna hear nothing you saying. I said, yes, Daddy, I know that. He's a man with 42 years of pastoring, Pastor of Arts, Pastor of Theology, Master of Divinity, Master of Sacred Theology from Lutheran School of Theology that is named a chair after him dying. He said it to me. But don't you stop preaching. You ain't telling nothing but God's truth. And white racists don't want to hear God's truth. That's where the controversies come in. When you start talking about racism, white supremacy, white exceptionalism, American exceptionalism, no. Those who are guilty of that consider that controversial. Those who are Black say, right on, Rev, come on with it. Tell the truth. Maybe somebody will hear. So those are my own words. Unpack the controversies of Jeremiah Wright.
Reverend Wright, thank you for speaking to that. You and Tiana have certainly given us a lot to think about over the course of these past 90 minutes. We have had some questions from the audience come in, and I have already incorporated many of those into the questions that I asked you earlier. But I do want us to take the opportunity to give both you and Tiana a moment to leave us with some words of hope, words that have the potential to inspire all Americans to fight for justice and equality in all spheres of life. And again, we're running out of time. We'll probably go about 3 more minutes here, but if each of you could take just 1 minute and just give us some words of hope. And Tiana, would you go first, please?
Sure. I just want to affirm and thank Dr. Wright for this opportunity and affirm his ministry, affirm his sermons, affirm his books. And the words of hope that I would just leave people is that we have a rich tradition of hope, of freedom dreaming in the Black church. So if you need a word of encouragement, seek one of Dr. Wright's books, What Makes You So Strong. Read A Sankofa Moment and learn about the rich history about Trinity United Church of Christ. I'm so glad that Reverend Wright is making up for all of his no's, because you can often find him on a Sunday preaching somewhere, and his messages are phenomenal. From one generation to the next, my elders, I give thanks, and there's no greater hope and encouragement than them.
I taught in the Seminary Consortium for Urban Pastoral Education from 1975 to 1995. It was an exciting class, an intensive from 8 in the morning until 5 in the evening, 5 days a week. Students would come from out of town to take that course. Most of them had never been in the Black community, from Fargo, North Dakota, from Utah, places far and wide. And I would take them in 1 week's time, them having read 6 books before the course started, from Genesis 12 to 1995. They kept asking me, is there a final exam? I said, yes, there is. And every day they get more and more information, movies, slides, lectures, books. When is the exam? I said, Friday. Friday I lectured from 8 o'clock to 4 o'clock. They kept looking at their watches. The exam is today. I said, yes, the exam is today. 4 o'clock I had them put everything away. All books off your desk. All note paper notes off your desk. All cheat sheets off your desk. All cliff notes off your desk. Here's your exam. When you leave here at 5 o'clock today, you're going to go into places that would never invite me because I'm a Black man. Your parishes, your parish members, your family members are going to say things about Black people that because of this week you know are lies, you know are not truth. And what you've learned this week will empower you to correct those mistakes and those bad names. You're going to hear members of your own family call me nigger, call us that. If you don't stop that, because now you know where the word comes from, Portuguese negro, negrito, Dutch nigger. If you don't speak to the truth and speak what you've learned this week, your grade for this course is an F. And only God and you will know that. If you speak up and speak the truth, you got an A in the course. And God will know that. Your grade on the transcript will read P for passing. I'm passing you on to your congregations to tell God's truth about African Americans and about Native Americans and about Asian Americans. We learn each Black History Month. I used to tell my students, we learn about African heroes and sheroes on the continent of Africa, Yada Santua, Prempeh, Nelson Mandela, Mbeki. Tell me 3 Lakota chiefs, 3 Cheyenne, 3 Creek, 3 Apache. We don't know the indigenous people's history. We need to know their story. We want everybody else to learn our story. We need to learn each other's story. Going back to what I said earlier, Charles. Once we learn each other's stories, I can respect you as Lakota and know that your way of approaching the divine and the Yoruba way of approaching the divine and the Ashanti way of approaching the divine and Martin Luther's way of approaching the divine are different, not deficient. And once we can master that, we can truly build a beloved community because we recognize each other as human beings made in the image of God.
Amen. Dr. Wright and Minister Webb, we have talked about a lot, but there is still so much more to talk about. And I hope in the near future we might have another opportunity to come together and discuss some of these concerns regarding the crises of our time. It has been a pleasure to speak with both of you. With conviction, you have shared words of wisdom, insight, and inspiration. You have given us much to think about. In so many ways, you are the voice for those that don't have, or at least feel as though they don't have a voice. Together, we can and we must ensure that America is a place where all of her citizens can enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I want to thank the audience for joining us today. Thank you for your questions, and special thanks to our sponsors and to those at the Ansari Institute who have been working behind the scenes, Director Dr. Mahan Mirza, Senior Content Specialist Josh Stowe, Administrative Assistant Sheila Cristoforo, Teaching Professor Alexander Shue, and Tim Checkley from Notre Dame's IT department. On behalf of all of us, and until next time, I'm Charles Powell. Goodbye.